Dawson is very much akin to Thucydides, the great classical Greek historian, of course, in that Dawson simply says what he sees. There's very little hypothetical with Dawson. He's very, very much sharing what is present in his purview of the time. At the same time, the deeper element of Dawson is that he is quite, in a philosophical sense, Augustinian, in the sense that Dawson can see not only history and tell us what is happening at this time, but Dawson is also able to see through history. He is able to see a deeper narrative that is going on during certain periods of time, and if you attach those periods of time to others, an even grander narrative that is being told. It's my wish to share this with you today. I'm going to do it in a very sort of a format that I hopefully would be entertaining for you as well. Dawson, of course, I'll be sharing the first part of the book, wherein he will detail the progress of Western education, more or less from classical Greco-Roman times up to about the Enlightenment. We'll take a little bit of a break halfway through, just to ask if you have any questions, and I'm more than happy to entertain questions at that point, but we'll be looking at a PowerPoint presentation of some art and some art history to sort of give us, how should we say, a fuller perspective of the times that Dawson is talking about and critiquing throughout history. The inspiration for this kind of format comes from my experience with two mentors, I guess, of mine. The first was a Jesuit priest, an American Jesuit priest by the name of Father James Donnellan. He was a priest and president of the Ateneo de Manila University in the Philippines, the Jesuit university in the Philippines, where myself and my siblings went to school. My father went there as well. Jim Donnellan went to school in Maryland at Woodstock Seminary. He then was sent over to Oxford because he showed a great, I guess, ability to assimilate English literature. Jim Donnellan would show, towards the latter years of his life, what he called the Grand Tour. And of course, what I'm doing today is a small homage to that. Jim Donnellan's Grand Tour was, he would show, essentially, this is very old tech, of course, back in the 1980s, 1970s, but he would show essentially pictures from his travels through Europe. And he would describe these travels as akin to the grand tour that European nobility used to take several centuries ago, to sort of be more educated, aside from reading books, to see the quality of the people as well, and the quality of civilizations that you're viewing and learning about in books. So what I'll be doing, of course, is showing you as well pictures from my travels with my family in Europe, and hopefully to give some perspective, at least contextually, to what Dawson is speaking about in the times that he's dealing with. Second inspiration, of course, comes from a man called Ralph Mcinerney. Now, I owe a man in the audience right now, John Galton, a favor for this, for bringing Mcinerney over to speak at Campion College, a college in San Francisco, Catholic college, where I worked many, many years ago. Mcinerney, of course, was a great philosophy scholar at the University of Notre Dame. In addition to this, you may have perhaps seen some of these shows. He was famous for writing what came to be known as the Father Dowling Mysteries. The mysteries where you had essentially Tom Bosley, the dad from Happy Days, in a collar solving crimes, going through, I think in the Chicago area. In many ways, I guess that was Mcinerney's homage to G.K. Chesterton, sort of an American Father Brown in that sense. When Ralph Mcinerney came to Campion College many, many years ago, when I was still teaching there, I was a much younger academic at that point. I remember him saying, and it really stuck in my mind at that time when he said it, I remember him saying something to the effect that philosophical truth and sanctity were the same thing. As a person who studied philosophy for many, many years in St. John's College, and of course, who ended up teaching it afterwards, I was startled at something so simple, but something being said where you are putting two things together, which are very, very different, of course, and finding not too much separation between the two. When I bring up Mcinerney and his comment of sanctity and truth being the same thing, if you add to that the way in which Father James Donnellan educated us in the Philippines many, many years ago, he educated us through looking at beautiful things, artworks through Europe, cathedrals, many, many glorious things to look at. He was educating us through beauty. And so for this specific presentation, I started thinking, well, true, good, and beautiful aren't exactly all that bad. and they kind of go together as the basis of an education. So we'll begin, of course, just so you guys know how the lay of the land is going to be as far as the presentations go. We'll be beginning with Greco-Roman education. What I'll do at the beginning of each presentation of each picture, I'll be reading from the book from Christopher Dawson, Crisis of Western Education. I'll tell you which page to look at if you have the book in front of you. I'll be reading from him a description of education during that time. And then I will go on to show you the visual, of course, and what that means for that current period of time, and to give it a little bit more context to what we're doing. Okay? Again, audio okay? Just double checking again. Everybody cool? Thanks very much. Thank you. Basic question I'd like to start off with. I can't help it. It's an old habit, Socratic method I learned from St. John's College in Annapolis. Very basic question, of course, which is, since we are examining something that Dawson calls a crisis of Western education, before we get way ahead of ourselves and begin to examine what that crisis is, I'm more of that perhaps in the next meeting. We're sort of leading up to that with this meeting, sort of building up to it, like a prequel in a way. With regards to Crisis of Western Education, this title by Dawson, there's a word that comes to mind from Aristotle, which of course is the word telos, T-E-L-O-S, which means, in many sense, if you sort of examine it, it means the point of doing something, the purpose of something, why that thing exists. The question why, by the way, is the most human of all questions. I mean, we ask what, when, how, and where, but it's when we begin asking why that we begin really distinguishing ourselves as a human species, as human beings. So when we think of telos, the idea of the purpose of something, of the why of something, if I could just ask a question before we get any further, what is the purpose of education? What is it there for? What is the point to it? By the way, we're talking 2020 education, yes? We're talking numbers in the tens of thousands of dollars every year for people who go to college, for their parents who write those checks out. It's not exactly a small thing to do or a small investment to make. The question then would be, what is the point to it? What does one get out of it in that sense? So what do you guys think as far as the telos of education? What is it there for? Anybody have any, as far as a guess as to why we even do this? I'm hearing something from John Marr to everyone in chats. Transmission of knowledge. Very good. What kind of knowledge, though? If education is about transmitting knowledge, is it all types of knowledge? Is it some kinds of knowledge? What exactly is being transmitted? And what is the point to this?
Well, it could be all kinds of knowledge. All kinds of knowledge to to lead the good life. I guess that'd be the classical answer. These days, it'd be to get a job in college.
Yes, a very practical sort of in that sense. Yes, to make oneself employable in the end. Very good. Trish, you raised your hand earlier.
Can you hear me, first of all?
Yes. Well, all good.
Okay. In the book, he says it's the transmission of culture.
Mm-hmm. And what would we define as culture, since we say that?
He talks about it as being everything: religion, language, literature, but even the customs of daily life. Okay,
so it goes from larger umbrella type things as far as faith, institutions, political organizations, to basic things we do in everyday life. So education is transmitting this to future generations. Very good, okay. Mark, you had your hand up earlier, Mark Wimbush.
I must confess, first of all, that I have not read the book, which I regret.
That's okay.
I've not been able to.
I'm not going to give you any Hail Marys. Okay. Very good.
It seems to me that there are a couple of things that are the purpose of education. One of them should be to develop the spirit of young people, rather than just letting them respond to their instincts all the time and just live like animals. And the other one is to create a society that has some kind of stability and continuity, because it's centered around some central ideas that are part of the culture.
Yes. When you say regarding the spirit that you said earlier, what is the wording you chose for with regards to the spirit of the young?
Well, developing the spirit so that they don't just live like animals. Right.
To have at least a higher level of existence than our animalistic selves in that sense. Okay. What types of things would you think would go in, would sort of contribute to that? If we are to develop spirit by transmitting knowledge or the souls of the young, what exactly are those things that would contribute to that? There's many things we could teach them. There's all sorts of information you could pass down. But what kinds of things specifically would serve to the betterment of those receiving that knowledge?
Are you asking me, or are you asking
anybody
everybody?
at all? Feel free, though, Mark. Go ahead.
Well, I think just persuading people that there's more to life than just what their five senses convey to them. One could argue for a specifically Christian ethos, but I don't know that that's going to fly in the present day. And I think if one could start off by just having people recognize the importance of realizing that there's more to life than simply what your five senses convey.
Very good. Very well put, I would say. Thank you. I'll be beginning the screen share right now, which is, of course, the PowerPoint presentation. Thank you to David and Mary for preparing this. And we'll be showing you some visuals, and I'll be reading from the Dawson book to give us a little bit of a fuller picture of what he's talking about through each time period. Again, we're beginning with classical Greece and Rome. Again, as far as a sort of a purview, we begin with classical Greece and Rome. I'll then shift to the Byzantine period, the great city of Constantinople, and then I will move on to Western medieval education in the form of universities, a little bit of Thomas Aquinas at that point. Then we'll take our break, after which we'll begin with the Renaissance, then go on to the Age of Science, and end off with the Enlightenment, and see what Dawson has to say about each of those periods. All right, so I'll begin the screen share. Let's see. This, of course, is from Greek civilization and Greek culture. This is an archaic period piece of Greek art called a Kouros, K-O-U-R-O-S, kouroi in the plural. These were designed, there's of course a lot of debate with archaeologists and classicists about this, but these were designed for seemingly a variety of purposes. One was perhaps to decorate tombs of rather important people who passed on many years ago. And by the way, archaic period is the period of Greek civilization, roughly 8th century, 9th century or so, up to around the 5th century, up to around the Greco-Persian War. So that's about 490 or so, and 480 or so BC. We see this Kouros. By the way, where was this found? Well, I was lucky enough. This was part of a traveling show at the Legion of Honor Museum in San Francisco. This, I believe, is from the Getty collection in Los Angeles. It is called the Kouros of Melos, M-E-L-O-S. By the way, if you feel free to take notes if you'd like. Not that I'm going to give you any tests or anything, but sometimes it does help with retaining some of the background info with the works of art. Now, the Kouros, some would say, looking just from its basic appearance, some would say has a lot to do with Egyptian art and how should we say, and expression. There is the shared left foot in front of the right, seemingly with this idea of moving forward. There are the rather straight shoulders, sort of extending straight down. But it would be too short for me to say that this is solely derived from Egyptian civilization. Yes, Egypt did influence many civilizations in the Mediterranean. Perhaps we could even argue that Egypt, because it had a great influence on the Minoans, of course, a proto-Greek or pre-Greek civilization, this would eventually trickle down to archaic period Greece, or even the classical period of Greek civilization. What is unique, aside from connoting a little bit of Egyptian influence in this statue? If you note, generally speaking, how this is different from Egyptian statues that look very similar. When you see an Egyptian statue that looks very similar to this, more or less it is going to be an older male. We are talking someone of high position in the Egyptian government, in the Egyptian political structure, whether some sort of scribe who is very famous, whether Pharaoh himself. There is the communication of this is someone who has gravitas, who is important, who is someone we should take note of so much that we are remembering him via this sculpture. Now, what separates this particular work, this particular Greek work, from that? Again, take notice, it is a rather young male figure, involved, of course, with this statue. Now, there is very much a feeling within Greek studies that when the Greeks idealized young males in the form of Olympic games or victories in keeping with those games, there perhaps was an appreciation for the male form being very athletic. We don't yet see the very closely or clearly defined musculature that you will find later on, of course, in classical Greek and later on Roman sculptures. But what we do see here is an attempt to, in a small way, differentiate. The Greeks are differentiating themselves from the Egyptians and truthfully, from almost every other civilization from this period. There is for lack of a better way of saying it, there is a novelty, a newness to the Kouros. The Kouros, with the smile on his face, is almost communicating to us, I am something unique. I am something new. In the ancient world, there is nothing like me. I am breaking new ground, if you will. I'm stepping with my left foot forward and introducing you to something completely unheard of that we have not yet seen in the ancient world. Now, why do the Greeks and how do they get off as saying to everybody else that they are new, that they are unique and distinct from anybody else or anything else in the ancient world? Well, if you think of the concept of a standing statue, of course, yes, not in any sort of action, but simply standing erect. There was a criticism, and we hear this later on, when the Greeks would go to war with the Persians. There was a criticism that the Greeks would target towards the east, and that of course means Persia and its many lands, that the Persians practiced something in Greek called proskinesis. Proskinesis was the practice of literally lowering your physical body to show respect, to show reverence for a great leader. In the case of the great kings of Persia, whether that was Darius, the many Dariuses, whether that was Xerxes, who fought, of course, the Spartans at Thermopylae, it would take the form of literally lowering yourself to almost flat on the ground in the form of showing respect for somebody else. To the Greek mind, and the Greek mind, of course, unique for its reason and its logic, and it's seeking to find answers not just from priests or soothsayers in temples. In the Greek mind, there began to be asked the question, why do these people from the East, when they practice proskinesis, why do they lower themselves to other men? That is something you only do to gods. That is not something, an act that you would do to someone who was built like yourself, who had the same physicality as yourself, or the same properties as yourself. The act of standing, in a sense, is communicating that the Greeks have knowledge of something called citizenship. If I could draw your attention to the first part of our quote from Dawson, this begins on page 5 of the text. So let me just locate that. This is at the very bottom of page 5, the last paragraph. So I'll read this. This tradition is in many respects a unique one. It is distinguished from that of all the great Oriental cultures by the fact that it was not confined to a priestly caste or to the study of a sacred tradition, but formed an integral part of the life of the community. It grew up in the free atmosphere of the Greek city-state, and its aim was to train men to be good citizens, to take, and I emphasize this, to take their full share in the life and government of their city. Geographically speaking, the Greeks lived separate from other communities. They did not have a major metropolitan center, for instance, as you find in Mesopotamia or in Egypt. The Greeks, because they were separated by geography, had to figure out a certain problem, which was, how exactly do we govern ourselves? How do we organize ourselves politically, most efficaciously, in order to get things done? Now, in the process of doing this, in the process of establishing a political unit known as the polis, or the Greek city-states, the Greeks formulated certain ideas which would be the foundation of each city-state in that sense. One of the most important of these ideas, of course, was something called freedom. Unique to the ancient Greeks, there are, To my knowledge, no civilizations living at that time, 2,500, 600 years ago, at that point. There are no other civilizations who are telling the rest of the world, we are a free people. The Greeks, because they say this, because they emphasize their freedom, begin to develop an idea of what that actually means. The Greeks would say the basic level of freedom is something we can call freedom from. It is the sense that no one is directly behind your shoulder and telling you what to do. It is the sense that you are autonomous as a human being, or even as a people, that you are not subjects to any great leader, to any great empire. Now, of course, this would bring the Greeks quite a little bit of trouble in the form of the Persian Empire. The great kings of Persia, when they would hear the Greeks calling themselves free, of course, would be annoyed by this, because they would say, look, if the Greeks are saying they're free, they're saying they're free from us. And we can't have that. So from the very beginning, the Greeks begin realizing that freedom is something that you must have when you are not in control of someone else. And this idea of a citizen, someone who stands, someone who does not practice proskinesis, who lowers themselves to show reverence to a man who would be God, is a very, very Greek concept. It was to develop, as Dawson says, education was to develop a better citizen, to take a fuller part and role in that community. Again, we'll come back perhaps to the Kouros a little bit later on. There's another statue I have to show you a little bit later on that may bring back some memories of this Kouros, or perhaps of some trappings of it as well. Could I please have the next slide, number 3? Thank you. This, of course, is from much later on in Greek civilization, Greek history. We can tell that by the many folds, of course, in the clothing, which would be quite, I'm just saying this admiringly as a person who sees this and says, I could never do anything like this, even if you gave me a chisel and many, many years to do this. This particular piece of art, of course, is the East Frieze in the Parthenon of Athens. This was a cast made of that. Also, I believe, part of the Getty collection that went through San Francisco a year or two back at the Legion of Honor Museum. This is a scene featuring 3 of the gods of Greece. Of course, Poseidon to the most left, Apollo in the middle, and at the right, of course, Artemis, whom the Romans will call Diana later on. Here we see a further development of this concept of citizenship that Dawson will highlight as the telos of Greek education. Why does this particular piece of art bring up this particular telos? Well, there are other ideas now being put forward by the Greeks and their culture during this time. Aside from learning freedom from, which we learned a little bit with the Kouros, the idea that the Greeks were not lorded over by anybody else, that they were able to make their own decisions, they were able to dictate what they wanted to do with their lives. This sculpture, this frieze, gives us a glimpse into something more detailed and perhaps more sophisticated. The idea of freedom too. Now, the Greeks, since they thought about this to a great extent, would say, look, it's not enough for us to be free from control, from some external control, like some great king. I always tell my students in class, it's when you move away from home for the first time or go to college, you are no longer being lorded over by mom and dad. You are now there making your own decisions. Yes, you are free from them in that sense. However, if we only stay with that meaning of freedom, we do not get the full picture. The Greeks would say to understand freedom, you have to understand freedom too, which means just because you have the freedom to do many different kinds of choices, you were able to make better choices rather than worse choices. Now, what does this mean, and how does it regard this particular frieze? Think of the act being engaged in by the gods, by the way, not just people, but these are Greek gods that you see in front of you. Some of the most powerful ones, the earth shaker, Poseidon among them, the god of music and light, Apollo, the goddess of the hunt, Artemis. The act that they are involved in is actually sitting down and having a conversation, sitting down and conducting speech. The Greeks realized, perhaps more so than anybody else at this point in history, there are two ways that you can begin forming some form of political organization. You can either form it by speech, or you can form it by something perhaps much easier. You can form it by force. The much more famous now American founding father, Alexander Hamilton, perhaps more famous because of the great Broadway play that is still out, would write in Federalist Paper number 1. He would issue a challenge, of course, and say that historically speaking, governments were formed by two things: accident and force. They just sort of happened, or some very powerful person, whether it was Sargon of Akkad, Hammurabi of soon-to-be Babylon, would force his rule upon people. Hamilton, of course, will say, look, why don't we try a different route? Why don't we try the route of reflection and choice? Now, he was very much drawing from a Greek influence, I would argue, by saying this. The idea and concept that you could say, instead of using physicality, coercion, to get people to do something, why not instead rein in our passions, control ourselves to a certain extent, and elevate ourselves and other people as well by using speech? Why not make the choice with the freedom we have to be better than what we could be, to be a better citizen, which of course makes a better polis in the long run of doing so. There is another aspect of this frieze that deserves a little bit of attention as well. If you note the proportions of the bodies of the gods, what is notable? Well, Apollo is, of course, unfortunately missing his left hand, but nonetheless, you see very human aspects of these gods. You do not see the Egyptian human bodies and animal heads. You do not see these almost fantasy-based figures most often found in Mesopotamian sculpture, specifically Assyrian culture, where you have these winged genuses, these large lion beasts with wings, but the heads of men. The Greeks would look at something like that and say, well, it's just us, we're just Greeks. But something like that doesn't make sense. It's a little too over the top. It's a little too much of something. There's an old-fashioned Greek word from this time, one of the other more important undergirding ideas of the Greek city-state, and that is metron, M-E-T-R-O-N. It literally means measure or proper proportion. To the Greeks, it was an expression of their freedom to be able to say when something was just right and not overdone or underdone. To know and see something of almost perfect proportion. Now, why is this important with regards to art, and how does this extend beyond art? This is where you begin seeing the realism that later on the Renaissance, I'm sorry, could we go back to, yeah, there you go. We begin to see the realism that we see much later on in the Renaissance. The idea that if you're producing art, it must look like, at a certain point, actual life in that sense. But furthermore, what is unique about this frieze is it also shares with us, aside from freedom too, aside from metron, it also shows that the Greeks would manifest their freedom too by producing art for themselves. The gods, of course, are much in the backdrop. If you want to read Homer's Iliad, there's very much a sort of subtext where the gods are planning who gets to perish, who gets to live through these horrible battles in the Trojan War. But the Greeks would also put forward a very specific form of art called tragedy. Now, why is this of note? And how does this relate to freedom in the Greek context as well? When the Greeks began writing tragedies, the most famous, of course, the three great tragedians are, of course, Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides. When the Greeks would begin writing tragedies, they have a basic theme running through them. The basic theme is this story must have deep emotional pain and suffering, what we call pathos in Greek. But secondly, it must be the story of a fall. The hero of the story, not even the hero, the protagonist of the story, should begin the account at a high point, and then end up at the very end, at the conclusion of the story, at a low point. Someone is brought low. A tragedy is literally a story of a descent, of something going downwards. Now, when the Greeks would show us these tragedies, from Sophocles' great Oedipus Rex to Agamemnon by Aeschylus, you begin noticing that there are certain things that cause the going down of the main character. Whether the main character was simply cursed by the gods or by fate, or whether perhaps there were certain things within the person's character that led them to be led down a negative road. When the Greeks look at tragedy, they are telling us we are willing to examine what brings human beings pain, what brings human beings pathos and suffering. It takes a very educated mind to do this. More importantly, it takes a free mind to do this. Those who are living under the control of others. The Greeks, of course, would point to the Persians. There are many other civilizations at that point in time. Those who did not yet discover the notion of autonomy, of having freedom, do not really have the freedom to look in the mirror and critique themselves or critique their entire civilization. There may be a very heavy price to pay for self-criticism, especially for an entire civilization. The Greeks would say, this is how free we are. We are able to, with the education we are putting forward, by creating literate young people, by schooling them in what will soon be called the classical liberal arts, the arts dealing with language, grammar, logic, and rhetoric, and the arts dealing with math, geometry, arithmetic, music, and astronomy. We will begin creating, by educating in this way, the whole person. And by doing this, we produce better citizens who know what freedom is, who know what it is like to be a citizen, and who is therefore of benefit towards their community. Could we get the next slide, please? I think that's number 4. There we go. A little bit of a different change of pace with this one. This, of course, is the statue of an emperor. As you guys should know, this is about 2nd century AD. Unique to this statue, of course, is that the head is not of the statue. That was added later on. The head, of course, is of the Roman Emperor Trajan, who is considered to be, along with Marcus Aurelius, one of the better emperors in the Roman Empire. This specific statue is found in the Pergamon Museum of Berlin, on Museum Island, and it is a, how should we say, one of the great drawing pieces of the Roman exhibit. Now, with regard to Roman education, and how that works along with what Dawson is saying of what the Greeks and their ideal being creating education, having a telos of producing a better citizen, someone who will fully partake in that culture and community and political organization of that time. The Romans have a little bit of a different feel, I would say, than the Greeks. They have a different, how should we say, they have a different goal in mind. They have a different way of looking at the world. Really. A quote from the great British author, of course, G.K. Chesterton comes to mind, quite naturally with regards to Greece and Rome. I believe this is from The Everlasting Man, Chesterton's great work. Chesterton will say, the moral genius of Greece is akin to the branches of a great tree stretching upward, ever upward into the heavens. The moral genius of Rome are the roots of that same tree, digging deep into the earth. The Romans are of a much more pragmatic mindset than the ancient Greeks. By the way, very self-conscious, the Romans know, looking at a mirror, a bronze mirror, at that time, that they are nowhere near as aesthetically advanced as the Greeks. They are nowhere near as brilliant, as naturally talented as the Greeks, these beings whose aesthetic and moral sense stretch upward into the heavens. But the Romans know there is something that separates them from Greece. Having studied their own history, having studied the history of other peoples beside themselves, the Romans will begin saying there is something of a tragic flaw, since I brought up tragedy earlier, in Greek civilization. There is a story that happens one too many times when you think of Greek history. If you think, for instance, of the very brave stand of Leonidas and his 300 at Thermopylae against hundreds of thousands of Persians, they are undone, the Greeks are, at the very end of this stand. They are undone by betrayal, by literally being undone by one of themselves. This happens, of course, again, in Thucydides' History of the Peloponnesian War and the Greek Civil War. The island of Melos, where the Kouros, by the way, earlier was said to be from. The island of Melos saw another episode of the Athenians surrounding this entire city-state, conducting a little bit of a discussion with them as to why they should surrender. When the Melians refused to surrender, the Athenians besieged the city-state, and then people from within the city betrayed their own kind and literally let the Athenians in. And that extinguished that city-state forever. The Romans look at this and say, here is where we can outdo the Greeks. There is one specific quality, and this is very much seen in Roman education. There is one specific quality that separates us from the Greeks and Greek culture. We can see this most, how should we say, poetically, if we examine the heroes of great Greek epic, not Greco-Roman epic poems. In Homer's Iliad and Homer's Odyssey, the respective protagonists, or perhaps heroes, of those two stories, Achilles in the Iliad, Odysseus in the Odyssey, of course, they are exceptional men. There is something about them that is different, that is superior to anybody else around them. For Achilles, of course, who is part immortal, he is gifted with an almost invulnerable body. He is a more athletic, a more fierce, a stronger person than anybody else around him, a greater slayer of men than any other warrior around him. Odysseus, being given the greatest amount of wisdom, of course, and the patronage of the goddess Athena, is the craftiest and the most clever and perhaps the most wise of the Greeks. So there's something special about them. But when you read the third epic poem from antiquity, that being the Aeneid of Virgil, we find a hero, Aeneas, who, yes, is part god himself. His mother was a goddess Aphrodite, but nevertheless, Aeneas has a quality that is a little bit different than the heroes of Greek epic poems. Aeneas is someone who faithfully maintains old traditions. If you give Aeneas a job, he will carry it through, come what may. The great virtue of Aeneas, the hero of the Aeneid of Virgil, is also the great virtue of the Roman people, piety. The capacity for being pious, someone who is loyal, who maintains old traditions, who does not turn from the fray, who is always there. When one examines it, frankly, it is quite an everyman kind of virtue, because you don't really need to be especially gifted like Achilles or Odysseus to have piety. Rather, it takes a bit of elbow grease. It takes a little bit of effort to show I am loyal to my people and to my kind. I will do whatever I can to maintain a better life for them, a promulgation down the ages of my culture. And this, of course, takes piety. Now, where do we see this in Roman education? And of course, where do we see this in this statue? Again, this is a statue of the emperor. Note, there is a very paternalistic aspect of this statue. This is the emperor acting almost as a father of a state, as a pater familias, instead of being literally in a family, but of the entire city of Rome, or the entire Roman Empire. Notice the way the hand extends and how the palm is facing. It is diagonal a little bit, but it does face downward, showing or connoting that this emperor is extending and showing you the length and breadth of his domain, of his dominion. Roman education began from fathers. They were supposed to instruct their sons in basic morality. Morality from the Romans, of course, not in a very theoretical or philosophical way like the Greeks would, but in a much more practical way that involved piety. You were being instructed in the Roman family of what types of things you should know to keep this family together. By extension, these types of things would also make you keep the city, republic, and later on empire together. Chief of these practices a little bit later on when more formal schooling was made possible, chief of these abilities was rhetoric. By the way, rhetoric is found in Greek education as well, but it becomes a little bit more important in Roman education. The Romans were not necessarily interested in rhetoric for the sake of deliberating, for instance, what is the idealized form of justice in the world, as Plato would do in his Republic. The Romans are not necessarily doing that. What the Romans are doing is using rhetoric to better cement, to better solidify this thing they are trying to establish. In the beginning, res publica, the public thing, the Republic, and later on, of course, the Roman Empire, in that sense. There is a quote, of course, from Virgil. I mentioned Virgil's Aeneid earlier, that says that the Romans have a very specific telos themselves, apart from their educational telos. The Romans see themselves as those who would set order to the world. In the words of Virgil, of course, he would say, "Remember thou, O Roman, to rule the nations with thy sway. These shall be thine arts. To crown peace with law, to spare the humbled, and to tame in war the proud." You don't get to be the civilization that sets order to the ancient world if you do not have a house that is in order first. And in order to have this, the Romans must have a system of education that prepares one to be an administrator, that prepares one to be a caretaker, if you will, of their civilization, with the undergirding value of piety. Now, by the way, why were the Romans so attached to piety? It is ironic that one of the first times we hear of piety literally being spoken of comes from Aristotle, of course, from Greek philosophy. In Aristotle's Politics, he will list the 6 requirements for the ideal city. The 5th, of course, is what he calls the most important. And this, he says, is the care and the service of the gods. It is simply the practice of going to temples and making sure there are not messes there, that they are cleaned at certain times, and that people organize their religious practices in an orderly way. So why would Aristotle say that this is chief, more important than funds, more important than food or crafts of anything along those lines? Because to Aristotle, he knew this before, perhaps along the same time that the Romans were developing this. But Aristotle knew very well that in order to have a society, a people, a city, there has to be something that acts like glue, that acts like some sort of adhesive that binds people together. This, of course, is where we get the word religion, from the Roman verb religare, which means to bind together. The Romans were quite religious in their practices. Of course, this is before Judeo-Christian influence. And they saw religion as something that would further solidify their civilization. They saw what was lacking in Greek culture. The Greeks were too preoccupied with thinking way beyond their heads into these otherworldly realms. It is us, the Romans, who will do the more practical thing, who will order the world because we have piety. Could we please get the very next slide? I believe that's slide number 5. Thank you. This, of course, is a painting from, well, this is originally from Constantinople. The dating of this painting is around 13th century, so roughly mid-1200s or so. This is found, by the way, in the National Gallery in Washington, D.C. So if you're ever there, you can always look for this when you're looking for in the medieval art section. Before I begin here, let me first read to you, since we're crossing over now into not necessarily the Western Middle Ages, but the Eastern Roman Empire, which is part of the Middle Ages as well, to be honest. I mean, it's the continuation of Rome after its Western half failed. But before we begin, I'd like to share with you, I just thought, I guess it was apropos, as we're discussing Byzantine education and the telos of Byzantine education. The Byzantines, I'll say this quite without too much, I don't know, to put this, the Byzantines get kind of a bad rap. If you look at how historians have talked about them, the very word Byzantine, by the way, brings up these images of inscrutability, of something you can't figure out, of something that's just too messy to deal with. This was a criticism to Byzantine history by the Enlightenment era thinker, French thinker, Voltaire. And I will read briefly to you. Voltaire will say of Byzantium, "This worthless history is full of nothing but declamations and miracles. It is a disgrace to the human mind." Because I tried to keep myself in all of my years of teaching to be as impartial as possible with regards to what I'm teaching and who I'm teaching about. But in this particular sense, I had to step away slightly from my little cubicle of impartiality and say that Voltaire could not be more wrong about this. There is much more to Byzantine culture and civilization. It is a much more profound culture and civilization than it has been given any due by future historians, especially during the Enlightenment. So what can we notice about this painting? Let me read from you, of course, a line from Dawson to describe what is taking place in this civilization. So we're looking at page 7 in our Dawson book. Bottom of the page of page 7, last paragraph. It is the second to last sentence in that paragraph. And I'll read this. Dawson speaks of what is happening when we begin seeing this new kind of education. No longer Greco-Roman now, but something that also has this new faith of Christianity. According to Dawson, and I quote, "The new Christian culture was therefore built from the beginning on a double foundation. The old classical education in the liberal arts was maintained without any interruption. And since this education was inseparable from the study of the classical authors, the old classical literature continued to be studied. But alongside of and above all this, there was now a specifically Christian learning which was biblical and theological and which produced its own prolific literature." We're now on page 8. If you scroll down slightly to the middle of that page, this is the middle paragraph beginning with "thus." Again, this is from Dawson. "Thus, by the 5th century, a synthesis had already been achieved between the two elements, and this remained the foundation of medieval culture and education. In the East, above all, this synthesis was the very soul of the Byzantine culture, which was at once essentially Greek and essentially Christian, which studied Homer and Plato, as well as the Bible and the Fathers, and maintained the tradition of an educated lay class throughout the Dark Ages." Dawson speaks of the Byzantine period, specifically Byzantine education, as a synthesis of what came before, as a coming together of the older pagan Greco-Roman forms of education with their own telos, with now we begin seeing a different kind of telos emerging, which will be more fully described when we look at the Western medieval influence, of course, with Thomas Aquinas a little bit later on. But what does this synthesis mean? By the way, this is no, how should we say, the Byzantines, as little, or perhaps as bad as a rap they've gotten, as little as they were studied, we have to begin thinking that they lay the foundation of what will later come to be known as the Renaissance civilization of Italy. Their scholars coming from Constantinople, when that city would fall quite tragically in 1453 at the hands of the Ottoman Turks, many of the scholars would escape to Italy and begin passing down the inheritance of this great humanism, of this great humanistic type education onto new minds, of course, in Italy. But that will wait until a bit later on. So where do we see this unique aspect of a synthesis occurring with this painting? Again, it is a Madonna and child painting, as you're seeing. Mary is on a throne. Jesus is a baby, of course, on her lap. Note the color uses. First and foremost, the color in the background, the gold in the background, is very much a Byzantine feature. If one goes to the famed Basilica San Marco in Venice, if one enters that, unfortunately, it's one of the great churches. You can't take pictures inside, much to my frustration a couple of years ago. But if you look into San Marco, which of course has a very heavy Byzantine influence, perhaps even influenced by Hagia Sophia in Constantinople, you begin seeing this color palette of gold. Now, what is the point of this? Is this simply to show that the Byzantines were quite wealthy? Well, they were, in a temporal sense. They were the great intersection of the East and the West, and therefore had access to much trade and ways of making a living, a very lucrative one during the time period. But more so than this, the gold connotes a sense of otherworldliness that the Byzantines are trying to communicate to us. They are trying to communicate to us that there is something beyond the physical world you're living in right now. A heavenly world, perhaps, a world of perfection, perhaps, but there is something beyond what you can immediately sense and feel at this moment. Additional color palette, the blues and the reds. Now, this will be very important, of course, when we get to the Renaissance slides. There is more of this as far as a theme as well. Historically speaking, the blues with Mary were to give respect to her holiness. And the red, of course, usually, uniquely enough, Mary is wearing both. It's usually an inner layer of clothing that is red with the blue outer garment. But in this case, it is Jesus, the baby Jesus, with the red with the red garment. This, of course, to symbolize the passion, soon to be, well, give or take 33 years, suffered by the Christ in his sense of saving the souls of humanity. If we look at this painting, we begin to realize there's a lot more here than what the criticism of past historians, especially people like Voltaire in the Enlightenment, would say. When we look at this painting, we realize this is a painting that is not necessarily being done to impress us with the ability of the person who is painting. Now, this is not to say this is not a highly skilled work. Obviously it is. But the ethos here is not of someone who is showing you, look at my craft, look how well I can paint what I'm painting. What is occurring here is something I heard of a modern day icon painter, a Greek icon painter, communicate about the painting of these icons found in the Eastern Orthodox Church, which is the way they are painted. It is meant to communicate to us, the viewer, a certain participation in the work of art. How is this done in the figures you see? Please note that the right leg of Mary, it is bent. You see the knee is right around here. It is higher than the left, which gives us the impression that the higher knee is the one to the rearward position, whereas the lower knee is the one more closely coming towards us. In the tradition of icon painting, what is being done here is almost as if the painting, the figure, is reaching out beyond its two dimensions. It is reaching out, creating a certain space, and inviting us as viewers or believers to enter that space and to contemplate what is trying to be portrayed. There's a saying, but again, from this Greek icon painter, I can always email you guys. It's actually a video you can find on YouTube, a very interesting one. What is being said here is knowledge is participation. If we want to know something, we must participate in that something. A rather profound statement in terms of not only art, but also philosophy. And a moment where this synthesis that Dawson is talking about takes great shape. The Greek philosopher Plato, if you are familiar with the painting by Raphael, of course, yes, the School of Athens, where Plato and Aristotle are looking at each other, and Plato is holding the Timaeus in one hand, and his one hand is stretching up to the heavens. The connotation here is that Plato, student of Socrates and teacher of Aristotle, with no Judeo-Christian influence whatsoever, at least I can safely say that, Plato would present us a certain reality that goes beyond the actual objects, the physical objects of this world that we see in front of us right now. What does this mean? When we learned Plato, of course, at St. John's College in Annapolis many years ago, yes, we were told by our tutors, who were our professors, but that's what we called them back then. We are sitting on chairs. We have a table in front of us. Now, the table that we happened to be sitting next to in the classroom had 4 legs and was rectangular. But you could go to another classroom and find one that was round and that maybe had 3 legs. It was a different type thing, but we still called it table. So why is that? Well, this is a very rudimentary way, by the way, this is how we explained this when we were much younger. But there is another world, according to Socrates, where the perfect version of table or dog, horse, person, somehow rests. And we are drawing influence from that perfect world and trying to be that perfect. Now, that perfect world, of course, was the world of forms, the world of perfection. it did not only mean people or tables or dogs or horses, but it also meant much more abstract concepts. In the Platonic world of forms, you have the form of beauty. We can look at beautiful paintings all day and perhaps have different opinions as to what constitutes a beautiful painting. Yet, even when we disagree, we are halfway admitting that our mind somehow is able to apprehend, to understand that there is some kind of perfect beauty, that other physical forms of beauty are simply partaking of and are representative of, and who try to, in as much as they can, aspire to be like what is most perfect in that world of forms, in that world of beauty. So how, again, do we see that in this painting? Again, that's from Plato, Plato's philosophy. You can find this, of course, in the Republic of Plato. In this painting, this space being created by the way that Mary is sitting, this diagonal sort of arrangement where one part of her body is in front of the other, it creates this almost funnel for us to maybe participate in, to enter and at least contemplate what is being communicated by this painting. And what is being communicated by this painting? Turn your attention to the way that the baby Jesus, he is giving the key and row. It looks like symbol with his right hand. Looking at his mother, he has already a symbol of a cross, a halo on top of his head, but he is looking at her rather seriously, but perhaps with the look of assurance that he is going to live a life which will end up with the red of his passion, but he is telling her this is what he is supposed to do. This is what his lot in this earthly existence is supposed to do. To be honest, when I first saw this painting a few years ago at the National Gallery in Washington, the first thing that really jumps out at you is the gaze of Mary, as she is looking literally at you, the viewer, through this space created by the diagonal workings of the Byzantine or iconic painter. The eyes look straight at us. There is no smile. There is a somberness and a seriousness looking at us, communicating perhaps to us as she is holding her child. Communicating to us, this is my child. Realize what he is about to do, symbolized again by the red for the passion of the Christ. Realize what sacrifice is about to be made. And try to at least participate, think, contemplate. Very Greek, by the way, very Plato in that sense, that we are seeing in this awfully profound work of Byzantine art. There is a sense, last note on this, what is unique about the Byzantines is that they literally built a civilization, a political arrangement that resembled in their minds what the heavenly realm would be like, with the emperor almost serving as God, with citizens binding in many aspects their own thoughts, their own personal consciences to that of the state. And the state, of course, would be governed by biblical truth itself. What is unique about this is that if you're familiar with St. Augustine in the City of God, this is very Augustinian in the sense of founding an earthly political arrangement that is heavenly and earthly at the same time, and having somehow them work together. Now, what is unique about this is that Augustine will not arrive into Byzantine culture until roughly the 1200s, right around the time of this painting. So it's as if they had some sort of very interesting parallelism that is happening with Augustinian thought, and that, of course, is much more prevalent in the West. Thank you. Could we get the next slide? That is the number 6, please. Not necessarily a work of art, but I would say a rather artful work. This is called the Marquette Bible from Marquette in France. This was, again, very lucky to have seen this in San Francisco, and the Legion of Honor Museum had this as part of a traveling exhibit. It is, I believe, in Franco-Flemish on parchment, dated to around a similar time as the Byzantine painting you saw earlier, so roughly later 1270s or so 13th century. And let me give you first a little bit of context from Dawson to at least get us going with that. We are looking at page 15. This is last paragraph of page 15, close to the bottom. Paragraph that begins with, but this achievement, if you scroll down a little bit, there will be a sentence mid-paragraph beginning with, it was through these new orders. So I'll read from here. Again, this is from Dawson. It was through these new orders that the old monastic ideal of the consecration of learning to the Christian way of life was renewed and raised to a higher intellectual plane. Hence, the great age of medieval scholasticism was also the great age of medieval mysticism, and the aridity of the method of logical disputation was transcended by the higher contemplative knowledge of spiritual reality. The medieval mind was always conscious of man's final end and the goal of his intellectual and moral pilgrimage, as Dante sees it in the great concluding passage poem. Now we are getting to the telos of the medieval world. We begin seeing it with Byzantine art and Byzantine education, and now we see it a little bit more fully with Western education, as is being first established by monks in monasteries and later on soon to be in universities. What is notable about this Marquette Bible? Well, it was found in a Cistercian convent a couple of hundred years after it was done. And as history would say, it was read aloud by monks and nuns during meal times. You were literally reading scripture to each other during meal times. This is not specifically done to be a work of art, but please note, by looking at the blue and gold on the specific pictures or graphics on the text, there is a little bit of artful, how should we say, a little bit of artistic freedom being performed on this. The materials I believe here being of use is tempera, the blue, a gold leaf with the gold over here as well. Now, Dawson will say, what begins happening in the West, it takes a little bit for the West to catch up, frankly, with the Byzantines, because they have this almost unbroken chain of education stretching back to earlier Greek times. When the fall of the Roman Empire in the West happened, you have what come to be known as the Dark Ages. I kind of think that's an uncharitable name, but nevertheless, they're known as that. What begins happening roughly 9th century or so, through the persona of Charlemagne, the great emperor in the West, is the establishment of educational centers throughout Europe, beginning with monastic schools, later on cathedral schools throughout Europe in larger cities. And then from these, eventually you begin to see the flourishing, or I should say the flowering of medieval thought in universities, where people who had studied in those cathedral schools, who now have license, begin joining with other scholars and forming associations to further more specific, more refined ways of studying various subjects, philosophy, law, medicine, etc. It is in one of these universities that we begin to see the genius, of course, of Thomas Aquinas in the 13th century. 13th century, as told to me by a very close friend and mentor of mine, the late great Father James Scholl, of the Jesuits, taught at Georgetown for many years. The 13th century, in Scholl's words, was the greatest of centuries. You had Thomas, you had Francis, and then you had Dante, all together in that one, the great intellectual sort of flourishing during that time period. Now, what is of note, and what does this university, which leads to Aquinas, what does it say about medieval education? You begin to see murmurs of this, perhaps, or I don't want to say murmur. We begin to see the building blocks of this with the Byzantine culture and Byzantine education. The idea that you have two traditions. You have the reason of the Greeks, and you have revelation from Christianity. Essentially, you have reason and faith. Now, those two things on the surface may not necessarily go together. Yet, in the University of Paris, St. Thomas Aquinas would say, no, they actually not only go together, but are quite complementary to each other. Perhaps a millennia later, Pope John Paul II would say that faith and reason are the two wings which lead us to truth. By having those two wings, they sort of help in different ways. So how do we see this with Thomas Aquinas? Again, studying in a University of Paris, which is built from an earlier foundation of monastic schools and cathedral schools before that. With Aquinas, he would say to us, my faith says that God is the creator of all things. My faith says this. But what if I could also show you that reason says this as well? That what is in your mind, this rational capacity, can also figure this out. Aquinas was very generous in his proofs of the existence of God. He gives us not one, like St. Anselm would 100 or so years before, but Aquinas will give us 5, the Cinque Vie, the 5 ways of finding out the proof of the existence of God. The second proof of Aquinas is built on cause, something, of course, he borrows from Aristotle. The principle of causation, of course, which means that you have effects which do not cause themselves, but of course come into being because of something else before them. We are the effects of our parents at a certain point, having wonderful music in the background and perhaps a little bit too much champagne, and voila, here we are, existing right now. And those of us will go on to sort of stretch that lineage further. Aquinas will say, if we examine the chain of causes and effects, if we examine it going backward, i.e. tracing what is the earlier and earlier cause, we have to, at a certain point, stop. We can't do it forever. There has to be some sort of almost first cause, he calls it, that gets all of the other causes into existence. Now, why does Aquinas say this has to happen? Well, Aquinas would say, look, we are all, in a manner of speaking, intermediate or secondary causes. We didn't cause what happened in the past. We are the products, the effects of what happened long before us, and what we are contributing now, this book club meeting, our conversations with other people, knowledge we will pass on to other people, that will go on further from us, the effects of us right now. But if we trace it backwards, we eventually need to stop at a certain first cause. Now, the Muslims and their intellectual tradition, of course, which also, like Aquinas, shared Aristotle, would use this in a certain argument, to show this. This is called the Kalam argument, which says that at a certain point, you need to have a beginning point. You can't have no beginning point. So how exactly would this work? Well, think of it this way. We are in 2020 now. It's quite a year, I'm sure, for all of us. I'm still trying to get beyond the fact that there's no barber to work on my hair. And nevertheless, we're here in 2020. And if we say, and make a statement, that there is no beginning point in the past that would somehow lead to now, what we effectively are saying is that the past stretches back ad infinitum, to infinity. There is no stopping the sequence of causes and effects going into the past. The sequence of time that we are enjoying right now in 2020 has no origin. The problem with this, the Kalam argument would say, again, using a little bit of Aristotle, Aquinas would use this as well in his second proof. The problem with that is, if we say the past stretches back to infinity, what we are also saying is that it takes an infinite amount of time to get to 2020. It takes an infinity to get to now. But using our reason, we all have this ability to figure out things through our reason. Using our reason, not our faith, by the way, simply our reason. If it takes an infinite amount of years to get to 2020, do we even get to 2020? Obviously, you need to have a beginning point. Now, beginning point and origin, oddly enough, perhaps not coincidental, the Greek word for this, for beginning, is genesis, where things start. We begin to see a flowering of intellectual growth, now putting together faith and reason. But now we have, with Dawson in mind, a different telos, a slightly more different telos than we had earlier with the Greeks and the Romans. Any questions you'd like to address from this progression from the Greco-Roman telos to now we have the medieval Christian telos? It's sort of I don't want to take too many liberties with this, but it's almost the reverse of a tragedy. A tragedy begins at a high point and ends up at a low point. I'm kind of being cheeky here, of course, because Dante calls his comedy divine comedy. A comedy is the opposite of tragedy.
Jose?
Yes. Hello.
Yeah, this is Warren. How are
Warren.
you?
Yeah, very good. Thanks. Thank you.
I just would need some clarification regarding the Greeks.
Yes.
We know in the book of James, verse 1:17, says everything good and perfect comes from above, from the Father.
Okay.
And I was just wondering, where did the Greeks get the idea of freedom? Where did it come from? Did it come from the gods? And then if that is so, did they have freedom from their gods? And I guess if they get freedom from their god, what does that all mean? What did their gods mean to them?
Very good. So let me address a couple of these things in order. First, you said about the idea of where would they get this concept of freedom, right, Warren?
That's correct. That's correct.
Okay, cool. Okay. The Greeks would say that they are able to understand this. It's not as if freedom is some sort of thing that dropped on their heads, but they're able to somehow apprehend this, to understand that there's a certain way of living that is more liberating for us, that is more freeing for us. When I mentioned earlier, by the way, yes, the 7 classical liberal arts, the liberal arts have nothing political to do with them. They are literally arts meant to liberate oneself. To liberate oneself perhaps from ignorance, to liberate oneself from slavery. And by the way, slavery did not mean simply that you were working in somebody's house, without any of your free will. The Greeks would also argue that you could, through the use of your freedom, end up slavish, end up a slave, if you, because of the overuse of your freedom, did too many things that were harmful to you and your family. Then in a way you would be a slave to these things. I'd say that the Greeks perhaps were able to understand that there was a certain way of nature through, to answer your question, through their reason, through seeing that certain things did not make sense, through looking at proskinesis, the practice of bowing down to the kings of Persia and saying, hey, we're supposed to do that to the gods, right, who are these powerful beings. So why are we doing this to simply people? In reference to the second question, which I think is that the Greeks see themselves as free from the gods.
Right.
I'm right. Very good. If one reads early Greek literature, which of course is Homer's Iliad, it's one of the earliest Greek literature, one could say perhaps that no, that the Greeks were not free from the gods. If we're looking at the Iliad of Homer and we see that people are fighting, yes, Achilles is fighting Hector, Diomedes is fighting so-and-so, there's the subtext in the Iliad that the gods are somehow playing favorites, that they're saying, okay, I want this guy to win today. This guy's going to die today. And somehow fate was just too constricting. You couldn't really escape it. But the Greeks did believe in something called Kouros. Kouros meant certain moments in life where the dictates of the gods and of fate would, for the lack of a better way of putting it, take a break, take 5 in that sense. And where we could, as individuals, choose to chart our course. And I argue that they were only able to understand this first by understanding what freedom was. So I hope that helps a little bit more. That answers everything?
Yes, you answered all my question. In fact, it negated my last question, is if they had the freedom from God,
right.
What did their gods mean to them? But so thank you, it did.
Right, no problem. Thank you. Right. Any other questions on the first part of our presentation?
Well, you end up into Thomas Aquinas in
yes.
this part of the lecture, who is well known for the idea of natural law.
Yes, very good.
That's very much a part of the Catholic Church.
Oh, very much so. I would agree.
As well, but that's where C.S. Lewis is very centered on objective truth.
Yes.
And that natural law brings us to that. And then we get into the modern period where this all falls apart. It's just one particular type of thinking.
Yes.
And you get into the understanding of many kinds of infinity. Rather than one infinity that can go to perfection, to multi-universes where the existentialist lives and is totally confused.
Oh, very, very much so. I'm not sure they're living there quite comfortably.
It's headed because they took on the rational wing.
Yes.
And didn't emphasize faith, which I think we might be returning to by psychological and sociological understandings.
Well said. Very good.
that's the trajectory of our heritage, and
right.
Most of us as pre-modern and believing in heaven and hell and all of that have a much other wholeness to us. The reason and faith is the foundation of Catholicism as well as Protestant.
Well said.
That gives
good point, by the way.
Meaning.
Very much so. So let's begin seeing how this height reached with Aquinas will begin changing, again, with regards to telos. Excellent point, Rich. Thank you. Anybody else would like to, before we go on to the Renaissance? And go ahead, Mark. Go ahead, please.
Hey, I just wanted to go back to the question you posed at the beginning of the stream where you asked, what is the purpose of education?
Yes.
And I wanted to bring up the idea that, making the slight shift from what is an individual's motivation for education to what is, in principle, the proper motivation for education, proper reason. And instead of looking at it in a more fundamental sense, you could make the argument that the proper reason for engaging in education is to improve your ability to make choices in the future. If you look at it in a close level of detail. That's more or less the reason why you're going to learn anything is so that when you come up against choices that you're making in the future, that you're making the right choices, whether that has to do with mathematics or anything else.
Well said. When you say proper, and you use proper, the proper use of, can you phrase that again, how you said it, because it's stuck in my head how you said it.
Yeah, so the reason I'm saying that is the most correct motivation for education is to distinguish it from just the general question, what is the purpose of education?
Yes.
Because if you phrase it generally, then there's many different answers that could be given to it, and they'd all be correct.
I agree. But when you say proper, though, I'm drawn to the distinction between knowledge and wisdom, in the sense that you have knowledge, which is the accumulation of information, right? It's almost like shopping at Costco, and that's a really big cart. You're assuming as much information as you can in bulk, in that sense. However, at a certain point, and this is something Plato would argue in the Republic, at a certain point, you have to know how to properly use what you know. Many kinds of knowledge can lead to rather disastrous ends. And so what separates a better decision rather than a worse decision? Very good point you bring up, by the way. Thank you. Mark, you had your hand up earlier?
Yes, just a small point, and perhaps it's a sideline. It occurred to me, seeing that fascinating archaic Greek statue of the Kouros,
yes,
the seraphic smile on his face.
Yes.
I couldn't help but being reminded of East Asian statues of people in states of enlightenment. Mm-hmm. And is there any connection, or is that just my imagination that's running wild?
Well, I can easily see it. I can agree. And with this almost sense of having transcended this plane we're living in right now and living like animals, as you had mentioned earlier, into something higher, something better. Perhaps this is the reason dawning on the Greeks in that sense. I mentioned Father Jim Scholl earlier from Georgetown. One of his, discussed over lunch many years ago at the Jesuit home in Los Gatos, California. He makes the comment to me and says that it's amazing how far the Greeks got with only reason, with no revelation. They pushed the envelope. They really strove mightily to achieve this great height. But it's really amazing how they did without the other wing, so to speak, that Aquinas will add, yes? Or John Paul II will add a little bit later on. Well said. So let's begin looking now at the how the trajectory changes with the telos from the height achieved in Western medieval education, beginning, of course, with the Renaissance. If we could screen share that again. Okay, thank you. Rather famous, of course, this is the David by Donatello, housed at the Bargello Museum in Florence. Date of this roughly 1440-ish or so. So right when the Renaissance is sort of getting into gear in Italy. So let me read you from Dawson, by the way, just to give us a little bit of a framework with what he says about the Renaissance. This is on page 21 of Dawson's book. It is the chapter 3, entitled "The Age of Humanism." So the very first paragraph of that page 21 again. The higher culture of modern Europe and of America also has been formed by the educational tradition that had its roots in the Italian Renaissance. It was a tradition that had at its center, not so much in the universities, which long retained their medieval character, but rather in the academies and learned societies, in the Jesuit colleges and the English public schools. Rather large claim Dawson is making, that European education and also American education eventually would be influenced by the Renaissance during this time period. So let's look at a little bit of Renaissance art. One of the more famous works of art, again, Donatello's David at the Bargello. I selected this in the process of producing this PowerPoint, in that it stands literally as a comparison to the Kouros in that sense, with a little bit of a difference. There's a little bit of contrapposto, the sort of like weight being shifted, not standing straight like the Kouros is in this statue. Of course, you guys know the story. This is the David from the Bible standing over Goliath's head in this. When I first saw this in person, when I was with Joyce in Florence about a year ago, the first adjective that frankly popped into my head when I saw this statue after seeing many works of art and now entering this large room in the Bargello where Donatello's David was situated, the very first adjective that popped into my head was, this is really cheeky. There's something almost impertinent about this young boy, this young King David. If we notice the face of this figure, in comparison again to the Kouros on the first page, the very first slide we saw, we see a smile of sorts, but it also seems to be a bit of a smirk in that sense. This is a period in time where Italy is now being visited by great Greek scholars who are escaping the devastation of Constantinople, who are passing on their inheritance, the inheritance of classical learning, of classical humanism, to a brand new audience. Now, what we see, of course, looking at this statue, is a bit of what I'd like to call something we see in the Renaissance in general. We see great range. We see, of course, the concept of the male nude, which, by the way, before this Donatello's David had not been done for many centuries, since antiquity. If you were doing a nude, most likely in the Middle Ages, you were doing it in Adam and Eve form to show some sort of human shame in that sense. So this is a rather groundbreaking piece of work by Donatello. You were seeing something new from the classical world back to the Renaissance world. But you're again seeing this fusion, something inherited from Byzantine education and then passed on, of course, to Western educational centers. What you're seeing is this fusion of Greek form and Greek style in the way that David is portrayed, and of course, a biblical narrative. Now, why do I say range? And also the second element being there is a certain tension that we see in this David, that we see in Donatello's work. By the way, very different from Michelangelo's, if you've seen that before, a much more commanding, very large head, very large hands, or at least the right hand in that sense, much more, how should we say, built to inspire, built to impress. This is built to communicate something a little bit different. Perhaps it's to say that Florence, a much smaller city, the other major cities in Italy, if not Europe, is coming into its own. It is developing its own culture. It is proud of who it is. It has a refined way of looking, a very refined eye of looking at style and beauty, something, again, inherited from the Greeks, the concept of beauty and how to translate this into the form of art. But where do we see tension? Think of it this way. On the surface, as I repeat myself, I saw this as rather cheeky, as rather impertinent, but by David looking down at me with his almost cocky, a very self-assured gaze. This hat on top of David's head, which does not look like a crown. It looks like something, frankly, from the Edwardian era. We're talking like, G.K. Chesterton's time, early 20th century, these long flowering hats with great figures upon them. It doesn't seem to make any sense in that sense. It's maybe aesthetically pleasing, but not serving any functionality. One can't imagine a shepherd boy having this as a helmet, to take down the great David. However, when one looks at the size of the Goliath's head, and the great sword, of course, which David is using to sever the head of the giant from Gath, from his body, there is also a sense, apart from the impertinence, apart from the cockiness, there is also a very odd sense, perhaps, of, if we can read it into this, of piety. Why? A shepherd boy of these physical proportions you see in front of you, very slight of body, very slight of arms, specifically. Those arms don't look like they've been spending too many hours in the gym, in that case. Do not seem to be fit enough to hold aloft the great sword of Goliath to sever his head with. Perhaps communicating that something else had to be there. Something else had to have been assisting David in the process of him reaching success in this matter. Perhaps some form of divine intervention had to be in place in order for this this slaying of the giant and this raising up of the nation of Israel to take place. So you have this tension of the Greek and the Judeo-Christian. It is not necessarily a destructive tension. Perhaps it's a creative tension, one that will lead to different ways of expressing itself in the form of art, in the form of education. Could we get the next slide, please? That would be slide number 8. Thank you. Borrowing from the theme of Madonna and Child, this is the Madonna of the Carnation by Leonardo da Vinci, found at the Alta Pinakothek Museum in Munich. There's a couple more. I think I have another work from that museum, a particularly wonderful museum, by the way, if you're ever in that, well, when this whole specter of coronavirus gets over, hopefully we'll travel again and see these wonderful museums again. Here we begin to see one part of the tension occurring during the Renaissance, of these two contrasting, two oppositely perhaps striving sides of education and of culture. This is from Leonardo, as I've mentioned. We see a Madonna and Child, but very different from what you initially saw with the Byzantine painting, of course, much earlier. This is roughly 1400s, I believe, perhaps late 1400s, along those lines, a little bit later than Donatello. We see Mary as a mother, of course, and the baby Jesus, but very different than the way they are depicted in the Byzantine work of art. You see much more three-dimensionality with this one. One thing that's very obvious is if you look at the rolls of fat of the baby, the legs and how they're portrayed, seemingly it looks like a ribbon that is perhaps at the waist or hips of Mary, showing us Leonardo's skill in painting something this intricate, to communicate something this intricately, to convey three-dimensionality and the craft in doing so. Note also that in the background, you see mountains behind the windows where Mary and Jesus are. The mountains begin taking on the appearance of blue. This is, by the way, a very interesting skill by Leonardo, showing you distance by basically the color of blue, to show you this is how far these mountains are. They begin with the eye looking blue in that sense. Florentine art, Florentine Renaissance art, which Leonardo, of course, is a great exponent of, is distinguishable from, well, I'll show you a little bit later on, Venetian art, in that it is very focused on drawing, where lines are very clear, where you literally can see the lines as they are separated, as they distinguish one form from another. Culturally speaking, Leonardo is showing a very different Mary. Her dress is much more, how should we say, it looks much more haute couture than what we see initially in the Byzantine painting of Madonna and Child. This looks like something much more involved and by translation, much more expensive. Something would take much more effort to make and craft. Craft is a key word with Leonardo. When he is showing us his work, in this particular case, with Mary holding a flower in front of the baby Jesus, he is showing you this historical theological reality, but at the same time, Leonardo is showing you his great skill, his great craft. This is one of the sides, if you will, of the tension of the Renaissance. The side that is perhaps wondering, how far can we push these boundaries? What more can we discover through the use of our skill, craft, and now reason that we have inherited in our humanistic learning? So Mary, again, has her hair also almost looking like it's been done, a very intricate dress. The focus is on the fineries of the painting. not necessarily on the relationship between mother and child. Contrast this again with what you saw earlier with the Byzantine painting of Mary holding her son, the Passion, with the blue and the red. In this particular case, Mary is wearing blue and red, as she has historically also been portrayed as wearing. But look, if you will, at the expression of the child and look at the expression of the mother. We see a seeking child, someone seeking the flower that's perhaps being held by the mother as something of a curiosity, as something perhaps beautiful, seeking actively towards it, going towards it. A little bit different from the Byzantine painting where the painting comes to you. You see more of a sideways sort of movement here, of the child moving towards the other subject and trying to participate in the beauty of that flower. But the one thing perhaps that, at least when I saw this about 5 years ago on a trip to Germany with Joyce and the kids, was the look on Mary was, and how to describe this, it was a little cool in terms of motherliness. She wasn't necessarily, she may be taken to be smiling, but it doesn't look like there is effusive joy that she is finding in this child. She is perhaps finding joy in showing the flower to the child and having the child strive towards it, but there is not necessarily the warmth, the passion that you see in the Byzantine work. So again, Leonardo is showing us one side of this tension of the Renaissance, of what is being developed in terms of education, in terms of culture. Could we please get the next one, which would be slide number 9? Thank you. The other side of the Renaissance, of course, being the Venetian side of the Renaissance. This particular painting by Titian, the foremost, of course, of the Venetian painters. In Venice, there is a church that takes a little bit of a walking to get to because it's further away from the main tourist destinations. The church is the Franciscan church in Venice, the Basilica Santa Maria Gloriosa dei Frari, the Franciscan church where Titian is actually buried. This painting is not found there, but that's sort of to give us a context of the Venetian influence on this painting. This painting, again, Madonna and Child by Titian, but this is found again at the Alta Pinakothek Museum in Munich, close by the way, to where I found the Leonardo painting. Now, what is unique about this particular painting by Titian? I borrow this from the British art historian Andrew Graham Dixon, who said once in a lecture that Venice, in comparison to Florence, always looked to the east. There is a much heavier Byzantine influence, the influence of the great golden city of Constantinople on Venice, than you have on the city of Florence. We see this, of course, if again you look at the placement. It's a very interesting thing Titian is doing here, by the way, by having part of Mary's body on one side, but having her legs occupy the middle and having another side showing background. But note, if you will, the position of the legs, the left one being higher and the right being lower, with the bare foot, of course, showing, almost pointing past the painting. This is perhaps Titian channeling a bit of Florentine influence in creating this space through which we can interact and learn and participate with the painting. But what else do we see from this painting? We see Mary wearing her blue and red, similar to Leonardo in this sense. We see her with seemingly a crown of stars. We see something similar with the baby Jesus, perhaps more of a halo effect happening behind him. The child seems to be at the same time rather, how should we say, restless, wanting to move past the seating position to something else, perhaps connoting a child saying to his mother, as you saw in the Byzantine painting, that there is something to be done, that the point to being in this world of the Christ child is to do something in the end, which of course is to sacrifice himself for the sins of mankind. Mary is looking at her child with much more warmth, at least to me, than you saw in Leonardo's. More perhaps of that Venetian warmth you're finding, influenced by the Byzantines. You have the background, of course, the deep uses of red, the flourishes of red and blue, the deep blue being used by Titian as well. Very much emblematic of Venetian art, much more so than Florentine art. One can perhaps think of Florentine art as more drawing and then painting, and Venetian art as painting, essentially using great swaths of color in a very passionate way. I mentioned the Franciscan church in Venice where Titian is buried earlier. There is a special extra layer of importance with regards to the Franciscans and the Renaissance itself. And that is, I borrow this again from the British art historian Andrew Graham Dixon. When one looks at how the Renaissance gets started, yes, we could say that it is the importation or the immigration of the great scholars of Constantinople that happened after the fall of that great city. But what happens a century or so before? Franciscans, with of course St. Francis being their leader, begin saying, we would like art to appeal to people more in a more humanistic way, to appeal to people's passions, to their feelings, to be relatable to people. So how do we do this? Please note, where Franciscan churches are usually built in European cities, they are usually built on the outskirts. The Franciscans were the poorer church in comparison of those times, where the poor of the city lived. So how do we get more of this with the people? How do we get art that appeals to people more? You begin to see more of the painting in a more realistic fashion. The going away of the Byzantine school, where it's more two-dimensional, but not really, because of course there is this participation being connoted, but you begin seeing more of this drive and this desire to appeal to people, to make people feel the joy and the pain of the subjects involved in the paintings. So again, one side of the tension of the Renaissance symbolized by Titian in comparison to Leonardo. If we could jump over to, let's see here, slide number 12, please. Thank you. There is a bit of a leap that happens. We literally leapt a slide. 10 and 11 I may work on later on for a future presentation, but it's more apropos for us to address this next great movement. And this is sort of where the modern age begins. This, of course, is Albrecht Dürer and his self-portrait of 1500, again found at the Alte Pinakothek Museum in Munich. Dürer was a German painter working around the time of the Reformation, and very interesting work, but we'll get to that in a second. Let me give you a quote from Dawson, giving us a highlight or context as to that. This is from page 33 in our Dawson book, chapter 4, The Influence of Science and Technology. This is the last paragraph on page 33. Very last sentence at the bottom of the page. It was a new world in the literal sense. This is again from Dawson, because the age of discovery, which began in the 15th century, 1400s, had removed the fixed limits of the old orbis terrarum and had suddenly opened to Western man a greater world of continents and oceans of which the very existence had been unknown to civilized man. Because of the fall of Constantinople, the Ottomans controlled the Mediterranean, controlled the East. So Western Europe had to look elsewhere if it wanted trade, if it wanted to access other sources of wealth. Of course, the Spanish going to the New World, the Portuguese as well, and eventually the British going to North America. This was the age of discovery. Beginning in the 1500s, you begin seeing something subtly shaping up in terms of various fields of study. In the field of the study of politics, you begin to see Machiavelli. In the study of philosophy, you have René Descartes a little bit later on in the 1500s. In the field of art, you have Dürer during the self-portrait. Mind you, what is unique about the self-portrait? There is a general theme occurring in this age of discovery, which is when people begin looking by necessity outward, beyond themselves, they are also ironically looking inward, in that they are making themselves the standard. They are no longer looking to a transcendental standard, but they are focusing on themselves as a sort of focal point as to what everything else revolves around. At a time when we are discovering that the sun is not revolving or coming around us, we're actually going around the sun, it is ironically an age where philosophically, politically, and artistically, we begin to say that everything else now revolves around ourselves. Descartes, of course, does this by doubting everything except his own existence. Machiavelli does this by refocusing politics from the study of what is the best regime, which had been the subject of politics for many centuries, into now simply handling the rabble you see in front of you, as Machiavelli would exhort his prince, to Dürer's very unique work. Now, going back to this painting, Dürer is painting himself, of course, in a almost Christ-like imagery. But what is unique about this, and what is the specific use of Christ imagery Dürer is using? The figure that Dürer is connoting is actually from the Byzantine school of art. Christ Pantokratos, Christ the all-powerful. You see him, by the way, at the ceiling of the baptistry in Florence. You will see him in the Hagia Sophia as well. It is that very stoic Jesus that is the judge in the end. Not the baby anymore with his mother, but the sort of solemn judge who has sacrificed himself once but is now judging mankind. It is ironic that Dürer would use such a potent image with himself as the subject of looking at Jesus. But where do we get this sense of looking outward and looking inward? Note, if you will, the hand of Dürer, the right hand of Dürer. When Christos Pantokratos, Christ Pantokratos, had been painted in the past in the Byzantine schools, he had been giving the key and rose symbol in that sense. But in this particular way, the hands are pointing. The fingers are not pointing outwardly. They are actually pointing inwardly. Namely, the index finger is pointing up. Now, one could argue he is pointing up towards the diagonal right from our perspective. It could be to Dürer's signature, to the year in which he's doing this painting, but it could also mean pointing towards Dürer himself. Now, there is a dynamic happening in this age of discovery. When one is looking outward and also coincidentally looking inward and making oneself the focus of everything, what is the one direction that is not being looked upon? One is no longer looking upward. The focus is on the world, and via the world, myself. We see this a little bit later on the next slide, please, and that'd be slide 13. This is a portrait by Anthony van Dyck. It is called The Young General. The dating of this would be the early 17th century, so early 1600s. And the location of this painting was the Kunsthistorisches Museum in Vienna, the Art History Museum in Vienna. Caught my attention when I saw this about 5 years ago. There's something resplendent in this painting, and it has a lot to do with the coming age that happens after the Age of Discovery. Let me locate a line from Dawson to share with you from page 37 in our text. As we advanced from the Age of Discovery to the Age of Science with Francis Bacon, when you read the book, as one of the main movers and shakers during this time period, Dawson will say that education will change as well. From the top of the page of 37, sentence beginning with, "For the greatest achievements." For the greatest achievements of the Renaissance science, as represented by Copernicus, Kepler, and Galileo, were based on the mathematical ideal of natural science, which was derived from the medieval tradition of the School of Oxford, from Nicholas of Cusa, and ultimately from Plato and Pythagoras, rather than from Aristotle and Averroes. And on the other hand, the more the scientists became convinced of the value of the experimental method and the need for exact methods, the more they came to distrust the abstract speculations of philosophers, orthodox and unorthodox alike. We begin to see a shift occurring in the age of science. Francis Bacon, of course, great thinker on this, a man who says there are two different ways of studying. You can study the things that priests and monks have studied for centuries in these universities, these elements of pure reason and speculative reason, or we could study the things that we could actually test, that we could actually empirically learn about in the physical world. You begin to see a wedge being driven between these two different types of learning. But more curiously, aside from a wedge being driven, there is an axiological argument being made. And by axiological argument, I mean, philosophically speaking, there is an argument being made that one type of education should now be superior to the other, should now be studied more than the other. And Bacon, of course, if you read Dawson, is saying this should be more the much more empirical way of learning. If we view the young general of Van Dyck, some research, by the way, describing this painting has said Van Dyck painted this in Italy during his stay there. This was a member of the Gonzaga family, perhaps of Italy. One notices a couple of things. The use of red, but very different from Mary and Jesus and the Passion, the red using the Passion. Now this was a red tent, also perhaps connoting, since he is a military man, a sense of war, or at least the aura of war surrounding him. Note, if you will, the gilt armor, the armor that is not only shining, but it is literally interlaced with gold, showing now the wealth that has been brought over to Europe from the New World, from the Age of Discovery onto now the Age of Science. Do we need really fancy armor that has gold in them? Not necessarily. Armor without gold can serve fine. But this is especially feeding into our sense, perhaps, of acquisition, of seeking out into the world and taking something back to where we are. The sword, by the way, at the hip of this young general, more or less is a fencing foil, typical of the time, very narrow in blade, not necessarily something a foot soldier would use, but something more to designate someone of great rank. Most important thing, by the way, about this painting, look at the gaze of the young general. Remember again what we learned from Dürer earlier and the Age of Discovery. When we begin looking outwardly, and by extension, by very, very odd extension, looking inwardly to ourselves, the one direction we are no longer looking. We are no longer looking up. We are only worried about the world around us, the empirical world around us, and ourselves as the measure of that world. To end us off today, the very last slide, that should be slide 14, I believe. From British Enlightenment painter Joseph Wright of Darby. This is called The Dead Soldier. If you guys are local in the Bay Area, this can be found at the Legion of Honor Museum in the hall, I believe it's hall 13 in the Legion of Honor. I'm a big fan of the Legion of Honor. So Wright of Darby was famous, by the way, as an Enlightenment painter. The Enlightenment is the age that happens after the Age of Science. We're talking roughly the 1700s. Wright of Darby was known as a painter who usually painted scenes of scientific discovery, experiments, scenes of industrialization, etc. He has a very interesting subject of this painting. I'll get to that in a second, but let me first give you a little bit of Dawson to give you context for this, our very last portion of our talk today. This is found on page 40 in our Dawson book, when he discusses the Enlightenment. On page 40, we are looking at middle paragraph beginning with throughout the 18th century. So I'll go from here. This is from Christopher Dawson, Crisis of Western Education. Throughout the 18th century, there was an intense interest in scientific ideas which spread through every class of society, from the courts to the bourgeoisie, and changed the whole climate of European culture. It is true that the traditional forms of education long remained unchanged. Both in England and France, the 18th century was a stage of stagnation in the universities and colleges, where the old scholastic methods remained almost unchanged, although they had entirely lost their vitality and their prestige. But outside the walls of the college, everything was being criticized and transformed. Not only were the most revolutionary theories of education being propounded by dozens of writers, but the Instauratio Magna, which Bacon had preached, had become a living reality, the dominant intellectual force in Western culture. The Enlightenment extends from the Age of Science. When the Age of Science says that there is a wedge between empirical knowledge and speculative knowledge, and hints that empirical knowledge is better, what Enlightenment education does is it says this should now be the dominant form of education. If you want to take time to set order to your soul, like Plato will say in the Republic, or Socrates will say in the Apology, if you want to do all these transcendental things, these things that are beyond the physical, go ahead, but do that in your own time. The dominant form of education going forward from now is what we can physically know about the world around us. But what is the telos of this? The telos, perhaps, is one that refocuses from creating good citizens, from preparing those citizens to meet their telos, to meet their God at the end of one's life, to now being a telos of education serving to preserve this era of material prosperity, an era and age of unending progress, wherein greater and greater comfort is being enjoyed by people. And by the way, that's not a bad thing. It's a good thing to have antibiotics, and in this age of the virus, it's a good thing to have hand sanitizer and all these great things. But what the Enlightenment is saying is that we are trying to establish a new way of being. And this can only be done if we focus on the success, the material success of the lives we live in right now. Going to Joseph Wright of Darby's painting. Again, Wright of Darby is known for painting works that focus primarily on scenes of industrialization and of scientific experiments. But now he is focusing on a mother, her child, and presumably her dead husband. The date, by the way, of this painting, 1789, within two very famous revolutions, the American and the French. 1789, of course, is the year that the French Revolution would begin. Symbolic, perhaps, the fire in the background of fighting that is still going on. Joseph Wright, a British painter himself, saying there is something, of course, that we perhaps did wrong with this colonization of the Americas. Note, if you will, the gaze of the child. In the Byzantine painting, Mary is looking at us, saying to us, this is my child who will be sacrificed essentially for you. Be cognizant of the gravitas of this sacrifice. This child looking at us from his weeping mother and his dead father is issuing perhaps a cautionary note, is saying to us, be careful how quickly you progress. There has to be something that accompanies material progress. And I believe it was Adam who said it earlier, that something that accompanies it is the ability to properly use it, to know what is proper and right for the occasion. If there is a lack of a sense of propriety, if there is a lack of a sense perhaps of morality that should accompany material progress, then the potential for this scene being repeated again and again is heightened. And by the way, with greater and greater technology comes greater and greater ways of doing great harm to ourselves. So now we have the very last portion of this presentation where Dawson is saying and warning us, in a sense, that we should be very careful at the rate at which we progress. When we begin next time, we will look literally at the problem he presents and his solution to it. But this has been, at least hopefully, a way to graphically show, historically speaking, how education has progressed in the West from the time of the Greeks to the 18th century. So if we switch back to gallery or view. I'd be happy to address anything or any questions you guys have. Things about the individual works of art, I can give you tips on where to find these works of art. But if you guys have any questions, I'm more than happy to address them.
When you're doing this tour de force, did you think anything about Francis Schaeffer's attempt to describe what happens way back in similar historical periods in terms of the rise and fall of civilizations and his attempt to then lead up to the question of how now shall we live, given all this emphasis currently on prosperity and personal peace. You know, his conclusions were there's a serious error of omission. I just wondered if any of that jives with what Dawson has discovered.
It perhaps does. Dawson, again, this is the Augustinian element of Dawson. Yeah. Dawson is very big in this concept that there are, which is why I say the Dawson sees history, but he also sees through history. That there is a certain narrative that is really there, that we really don't change too much throughout history.
Yeah.
Dawson's cautionary note is saying that at a certain point, something very old, something very elemental may be the thing that is going amiss. Go back to my analogy of looking outward and looking inward, but not upward. There is a story from Plato, of course, in the Republic called the Ring of Geigees, wherein the shepherd discovers this ring which makes him invisible. And since he's now invisible, he goes on and does horrible atrocities. But what Plato says very subtly there is the way the bezel on the ring is turned to create the invisibility from responsibility of the person who does horrible things is the bezel is turned inward. It's a very old thing. And Dawson would say it is as old as Romulus slaying his brother Remus.
Yeah.
It is as old as Cain slaying his brother Abel.
Sure.
It is something called pride that does not change. That's simply there all the time. And when we prosper materially, there is more and more encouragement to focus on ourselves, to turn that ring inwardly, so to speak, and to lose sight of what human beings for centuries, in their gaze upward, have seen as important.
Yeah, what has truly lasting value is not really asked at that point. They're just sort of in the flow of that materialism and so on.
Yes, I would agree. Very good point.
Yeah.
Thank you. Anybody else with anything I'd like to ask about the presentation?
I think this gets us to where Lewis is in the abolition of man.
Oh, very good. How so?
And his demonstration of that in that hideous strength.
Oh, okay. Yes, go ahead.
Showing how when we no longer see man in the image of God, but in the image of his current development.
Yes.
It gets us, it totally destroys our meaning, and we are confused. I mean, it's like artificial intelligence.
Yes.
We're being made in the image of cybernetics.
Yes.
And it's a totally scary thing, and that's what C.S. Lewis is describing in The Abolition of Man, is that we have lost our dignity.
Well said. Dawson would most likely agree. Dawson, one gets the impression, would say, trouble begins happening when we begin assigning ourselves our own telos.
Yeah.
Apart from acknowledging or understanding what is there as our telos, yes, whether to be a good citizen of a polis or the Roman Republic, etc., or to be prepared via education to meet our final end. When we begin with our own will, not necessarily our intellect, but with our own will deciding this is what I am supposed to be, we could get mired, in that kind of situation.
Yeah.
Well, it's the existentialist understanding that the existence precedes essence.
Well, Thomas Aquinas
from eternity with purpose.
Well, yeah, Aquinas would actually agree that existence has to come before. What begins happening with Descartes, with I think, therefore I am, is now you switch that. It's sort of the great shift that happens in the 16th century, where your essence comes before existence, which frankly doesn't make any sense. One must exist before you find out what you are. There's no point to finding out what you are if you're not yet here, in that sense. But there is a great shift that happens right after the Renaissance, actually, right when the Renaissance is happening in the Age of Discovery. Can I address anybody else's points or take any questions? You guys, I can perhaps do one more question. And
I just wanted to ask real quick, who was it that you had traced to the idea of faith and reason being complementary wings of a single entity? Who was it that you traced it to? Was it?
Yeah, that was from an encyclical by John Paul II, I think.
Okay,
from very much John Paul II. Sure, no problem. Any other questions? Well, I'm really happy that you all showed up. I hope that proved something educational and entertaining as well. A little bit more of this next time, but next time we will look at the problem or some of the problems that with the crisis that Dawson is citing and possible solutions to this. So thank you again.
Thank you, Jose.
Thank you.
We'll see you in 2 weeks.
See you in 2 weeks.
Thank you.